Welcome to Verbal Peak Radio. We give you a verbal image of life, and we are every day. People like to welcome you to the show. We're going to play a lecture by Karimio Okoye. Gives a lecture on From Indigenous American to African American Transatlantic Slave Trade. This is part 14, but he goes on to talk about a subject that I've spoken about before, about the black Native Americans that were here before Columbus. He talks about the black Native American slave trade, also went by Negro and Indian, that they took from the Americas before the blacks were brought here from Africa, and they took them to Portugal, they took them to Spain, they took them to West Africa, Angola, the Caribbeans, Puerto Rico, and parts of Mexico. So we want to delve into that today. And look, listen to the whole lecture. I know it's kind of long, it's lengthy, but it's a lot of information. I had to share this young man's lecture because it gives a lot of information. And go back and research some of these names, read the books that he gives out, and check the evidence. You know, check it for yourself. But here it is, From Indigenous American to African American.
Very common, it says here. It is not necessary here to review all the data relative to Native Americans, right, so-called Negroes, from Florida and the Carolina in the 1520s. It was very common, it says here. It is not necessary here to review all the data relative to the enslavement of Americans in Panama, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Mexico, Peru, and other countries, but there is sufficient evidence to indicate, at least through the 1550s, all right, this is an important date. Listen to this. Before John Hawkins, large numbers of slaves were procured and shipped to various locations. Sacco notes that King Ferdinand had been considering the large-scale introduction of American slaves into Spain. In a dispatch of July 3rd, 1510, he asked several royal officials what profits might be derived from shipping slaves for sale in Spain. But the rapid decline in the native population of Haiti forced Ferdinand to change his opinion. By decree of July 21st, 1511, Ferdinand ordered Columbus that no American slaves could be sent to Castile. This was to prevent the depopulation of the islands, because the Spaniards did not abide by the order. As was customary according to Sacco, the king strengthened his opposition in 1512, opposing a fine and the loss of the slaves sent. This order was also not completely obeyed, and other orders had to be issued in 1528, 1543, 1556, before John Hawkins. So you see, they even have to have laws because they were depopulating all these islands in the Caribbean. They were going crazy with it. By the thousands, they were being brought over there to the other side, West Africa, Spain. It says, but the crown also vacillated in its policies. In order of 1526 prohibited the capture of natives and their shipment to Spain without a license. They were to be returned unless the license had been obtained. So that's when they started doing the license thing, you hear? In 1526. In 1530, further American enslavement was prohibited. However, violations were common and the ban was lifted in 1534. 2 years later, a decree again prohibited the shipment of American slaves to Spain, unless accompanied by a document issued by the provincial governor giving his approval. So they're saying basically only the royal crown can start making the money now. They monopolized it. They're like, we need this money. A decree of 1543 prohibited the taking of free or slave Americans from one province to another in the Indies. Efforts were also made to enforce some of the above provisions. In 1529, the officials of Seville were ordered to facilitate the verification of legal status of Americans introduced there. In 1531, arriving ships were to be examined for clandestine slaves. Decrees of 1536 and 1538 ordered the examination of the proof of slave status. Finally, in May 1549, the officials of Seville were commissioned to liberate the Americans in Spain in a manner similar to what has then been attempted in the Americas. Especially in the years around 1500, some Americans were actually freed and returned to the Caribbean from Spain. it says here, but the numbers seem few in comparison with those actually shipped over there. In 1541, the bishops of Santa Marta, now Colombia, wrote to the Emperor Charles V that in that region, thus Spaniards were exporting American slaves from Peru to Colombia, and many were being sent to Spain with the help of officials and in spite of laws to the country. So they were going, so now so far we got a picture of what's going on, right? So they just grabbing Indians from anywhere. They had little ports everywhere set up in the major cities in the Americas where they had their governments, their colonial governors. And so there was Indians from Peru being taken to Colombia before they were being sent to Spain, right? By the law of 1543, the Spanish government intended to end Indian slavery in its American dominions, but the law was ineffectual. All right, again, so they're saying, because people like to use that, well, the Spanish, abolished slavery in 1543 and made Columbus send slaves back, but they're really just skimming through information. They're not really understanding what really happened, and that was just all politics. As it says here, by the law of 1540, the Spanish government intended to end Indian slavery. It intended in its American dominions, but the law was ineffectual. It was ineffectual. The American possessions were too far removed for thorough control by the home government. They couldn't control what was going on over here. When Spain took final possession of Louisiana in 1769, O'Reilly discovered that the French had many Indian slaves, and a proclamation which he issued in 1770 declared this to be contrary to the wise and pious laws of Spain. While not at once declaring these Indian slaves to be free, he ordered that the actual proprietors should not dispose in any manner whatever of those whom they held, unless it were to give them their freedom until the orders of His Majesty on the subject should be received, and further, that all owners of Indian slaves should make a declaration of name and nation of the Indians so held in slavery by them, and the price at which they valued such slaves. This proclamation was generally understood by the French settlers of Upper Louisiana as emancipating all the Indian slaves, yet the latter remained in slavery, either voluntarily or otherwise. They obtained some benefit from O'Reilly's decree. However, for when they escaped, they were not returned to slavery, and when they sued for their freedom, they received it. Thus, in 1786, Governor Meadle, in a case that came before him from St. Louis, rendered a judgment that liberated several such slaves. This judgment reminded Lieutenant Governor Cruzat that the ordinance of O'Reilly was not being obeyed. So in June 1787, he issued a proclamation that Indians could not be held in slavery under the ordinance of 1770, and declared that he judged it expedient to repeat the aforesaid ordinance so that the public might know its tenor in order to conform to it. Accordingly, the said ordinance was ordered to be read, published, and posted in the customary places. No order on this subject was received from the king, so Baron Carondelet in 1794 ordered 2 Indian slaves to abide with their masters until the royal will was expressed. In the same year, however, he ordered another Indian slave to be released. The new laws of the 1542, which supposedly ended several forms of American slavery, did not immediately result in the suspension of the slave trade or in the shipment of Americans to Spain. On December 18, 1547, a royal official wrote from Santo Domingo. So it says here in Spanish that His Majesty mandated, to take Indians, especially women, so they can sell them publicly in Seville, and that's in Spain. And from a lot from the Terra Firme, which was, South America. So thus in 1547, American slaves, especially females, were still being sold in Seville, and the acceptance of such sales in the latter city gave birth to the impudence of Spaniards in the Indies, who continued to ship American slaves in defiance of the laws. During this period, the northern coast of South America seems to have served as a major source of slaves, with slave ships arriving at Haiti from Paria and Cumana as late as 1544. It says here in Italian, Girolamo Benzoni was in the Indies from 1541 to 1556. He later wrote that all the slaves that the Spaniards catch in these provinces are sent to Cubagua. Cuba, right? The slaves are all marked in the face and on the arms by a hot iron with the mark of C for Caribe, with a question mark. When ships arrived from Spain, they bartered these Indians for wine, flour, biscuit, and other requisite things. And even when some of the Indian women are pregnant by these same Spaniards, they sell them without any conscience. Then the merchants carry them elsewhere and sell them again. Others are sent to the island of Hispaniola or Haiti, filling with them some large vessels built like caravels. Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. As we shall see, some Americans were still being shipped to Europe by Spaniards in this period, even though labor shortages, more than royal decrees, operated to favor their being retained in the Americas. Alright, so even though they were shipping them over to Europe, they were still using a lot of them for the plantations, the local plantations in the Americas. It was primarily Cuba, Haiti, and Borinquen, or Puerto Rico, right? Which absorbed Mayas from Yucatan. Alright, so all these islands were getting what? Mayas, not Africans. Mayas from the Yucatan. Huastecas from Mexico. Mezquitos from Nicaragua. And various other nations during this era, rather than Spain itself, or, let me add, Africa. Alright, so other American Indians being brought to these places, okay? Note, should also be made of the many Americans sent to Spain in capacities other than that of slave. So, not just as slaves that were being taken to Europe, right? And these are the ones that are rarely accounted for. Many were sent to become interpreters. Remember, they would send in a lot of them so they can train them in their languages, so they can bring them back to help them invade, right? And speak and be interpreters. Or to be instructed and baptized. Others went as curiosities or as entertainers. In 1528, for example, Hernan Cortez took a group of Aztec and Tlaxcalteco chiefs, including a son of Moctezuma II, to Spain, along with a troop of jugglers, acrobats, and dancers. Alright, these are American Indians. These also were taken to the court of Pope Clement VII in Rome. A different kind of figure was Juan Santos Atahualpa of Peru, taken to Spain and Angola by the Jesuits. Where? Angola. In reverse, Angola. Alright? Inca of Peru. It is evident, therefore, that it was not through direct executive decree that Indian slavery passed out of existence in Spanish territory within the present limits of the United States. In fact, from the instance cited in connection with Louisiana, it is seen that it did not pass out of existence until after the colonial period. Certain causes, however, contributed to its decline. Great number of Indians could be hired at very small wages to perform labor of any extent. Still, another cause which was less effective perhaps in Spanish territory than in that of France and England was the use of Negro slaves. The labor of the blacks was eagerly found to be more profitable than that of the Indians, and as early as the founding of St. Augustine, Menendez imported into Florida 500 Negro slaves. Alright, so Negro slaves meaning other American Indians. Otherwise, the labor of building that town would have fallen out on the white men and on the Indians whom he could impress. From the earliest days of Spanish occupancy, the spiritual welfare of the Indians was of much concern to the Spanish church and state. The materialization of such an interest was largely accomplished by the establishment of missions throughout the Spanish territory from Florida to California, chiefly through the labors of the Franciscans. The endeavors of the missionaries resulted in the establishment by 1615 of 20 missions in Florida in the dependent coast region. By 1655, the Christian Indian population of northern Florida and the Georgia coast was estimated at 26,000. By 1630, there were more than 60,000 converts in the Pueblo missions of New Mexico and Arizona. In California, the missions, the first of which was founded at San Diego in 1769, continued in a fairly prosperous condition until 1834. These large numbers of barbarian neophytes were presided over in each of the missions by a very small number of monks, who directed the religious and industrial activities of their Indian charges. It was necessary that a mission should be self-supporting. The Indians gathered at these centers voluntarily and submitted to the routine life of the missions, but the natives were ignorant and incapable, and the monks were in consequence the directing and guiding force among a population which responded in a mechanical sort of way. The natural result was that the mission life developed into a kind of slavery. So these missions were really plantations, they were slavery. The life of a California mission, though of later date and more fully developed than earlier missions of colonial times, affords a picture of the general condition of affairs. The Indians constructed the buildings, planted and cultivated the fruit trees and vineyards, tended the cattle, made pottery, wove cloth, and performed in fact all the manual labor that was necessarily required in an extensive colony. In return, they received food, clothing, and lodging, were instructed in the church doctrines and observances, and were taught dancing and music, and occasionally the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Their life was a regular routine, and though material comfort was generally in evidence, still the Indian neophytes were never allowed to act on their own initiative. Beyond their existence from day to day, they received no pecuniary reward for their labors any more than if they had been slaves. The Indians of the missions were generally tractable, but occasionally the desire for their former life of freedom brought reaction and rebellions, or incited and aided by the wild tribes, they rose and destroyed the missions. The revolt of the Pima in 1750 is a case in point. The alcaldes, or local officials to whom the king had entrusted the protection of the Indians, instead of protecting them, preyed upon them for their own profit. These men, like many of the colonists themselves, were often of inferior class and too far from the central government to feel any special fear at disobeying the laws that the home government might make with regard to the natives. So they were sending like peasants and lower class people, criminals sometimes, to run these governments, these towns, these Indian missions. You hear that? So they didn't care what they were doing or to really follow the government of Spain or wherever. They were too far away. They didn't care. Accordingly, the Indians were often induced to run into debt and had in consequence to mortgage or sell whatever property they possessed. They thus became subject to whatever impositions the officials chose to put upon them. In 1792, Fray Juan Agustin de Morphy complained to the Viceroy of New Spain that from each pueblo in their respective jurisdictions, the alcaldes in Texas were accustomed to levy weekly contributions of produce, that they required the Indians to perform free labor upon their estates, that they demanded heavy tolls from each pueblo at harvest time, that the Indian women were forced to grind the alcalde's grain, that some officials required tites or tithes of fleeces and compelled the Indians to weave them, and that the Indians had to serve as mule drivers and care for the animals of the alcaldes. The attitude of the alcaldes toward the Indians, furthermore, was repeated by the officials of the presidios or frontier posts. The same method of obtaining cheap labor was followed by the colonists. Frequent raids were made upon the rancherias or Indian settlements to secure agricultural workers, herdsmen, and domestic servants. Children were usually in demand, but adults were also taken. The practice continued indeed until late in the 18th century. A third region which served as a major source of slaves for Europe and Africa was the coast of Brazil. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, sailing to India, touched along the Brazilian coast. It appeared that at least one American was sent back to Portugal with Gaspar de Lemos. This initially friendly contact was not to last, however, since the King of Portugal seems to have envisioned the coast of Brazil as a second slave coast. He led a contract to Fernão de Noronha and a company of merchants to trade in Brazil wood and slaves. They were to send to Brazil 6 ships each year. 4 ships were sent in 1503, and they returned to Portugal full of wood and slaves. It is known that the trade was fairly regular after 1504. From the very beginning, then, Americans were acquired as a commodity and shipped to Europe, as well as perhaps to Africa. Portuguese slavers may have also ventured into regions claimed by Spain. In July 1503, a letter reached the Spanish court with the news that Portuguese ships had gone to the area discovered by Rodrigo Bastidas, part of Colombia and Panama, y traído esclavos, indios y palo de Brasil, and it says it carried off American slaves in Brazil. In 1511, the Portuguese ship Bertoa, with 2 Negroes and 1 non-Negro slave on board, carried some 35 American slaves from Brazil to Portugal. Another ship in the following year was described as having the deck loaded with young men and women. From then on there, a frequent report of Americans being taken to Portugal, some for showing to the king and some for more ordinary servitude, as Capistrano de Abreu noted. The Portuguese crown in 1530s authorized the creation of about 12 feudal dominions in Brazil. Each of the grantees donatarios was entitled to enslave as many Americans as were needed for local labor, but only 24% per year, 48 for one donatorio, could be sent to Portugal by each for sale. This authorization continued until 1549 and allowed about 216 slaves to be sent each year for some 15 years, for a potential total of 3,240 or more. Of course, Portuguese laws were frequently not enforced in the colonial areas, and many more slaves have actually been transported, especially since American slaves could legally be used without limit to man the ships for the passage to Portugal. The Portuguese began quite early to try to find markets for Brazilians outside of the Portuguese Empire. In 1538, 3 Portuguese ships reached Borinquen with 45 Portuguese and 140 American slaves, and a few free Americans. So there was, they say they reached Puerto Rico, Borinquen. A Portuguese captain later proposed to ship Brazilian slaves to Haiti, and initially 6 or 7 were sent. So you see that all these, they say that they were bringing Africans, the Spanish and Portuguese were bringing Africans to the Caribbean, and from there to the English were taking them and bringing them to America. These were from other parts of America. These were Native Americans they were bringing there by the thousands from South America, Central America, wherever they were grabbing them. In 1550, however, Charles V resolved not to allow the introduction of Brazilians as slaves. Some years later, a Portuguese ship reached the island of Margarita with 300 American male and female slaves. They were sold, but in 1556, the Spanish crown ordered the guilty to be punished for violating the law. On the other hand, in 1570, consideration was given to authorizing the importation into Spanish colonies of Brazilian slaves enslaved by other Americans. This category of slave, as well as Caribes, that is, alleged cannibals, could be imported. In any case, one can see that between 1530s and 1570s, the Portuguese were actively attempting to market American slaves far and wide. Okay, you hear that? So within Brazil, the enslavement of Americans proceeded very rapidly, primarily for the use in sugarcane and cotton industries. You hear that? Caribbean. Later on, the donatorios between 1535 and 1550 document this process, as in 1545 when Pedro de Goes wrote to the king that in the fields and sugar refineries of Sao Tomé there were enough slaves. The population of St. Vincent in 1548, including 600 free persons and more than 3,000 American slaves in 1548, according to a letter of Luis de Goes. So San Vicente, so they tell us that these are Africans they're bringing there. There's 300 American slaves, 3,000, American slaves there already. To To the south of Bahia, only American slaves were mentioned as forming of the labor force in 1584, especially in the southern and northern parts of Brazil, Sao Paulo, San Vicente, and Maranhão. And in the interior, the enslavement of Americans continued to be a major source of labor for centuries. Between 1630 and 1650, for example, from 100,000 to 200,000 Americans from the Paraguay region were enslaved and sold in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and elsewhere. So if these people, if you see the Paraguayans people of today, they're very light-skinned mostly. Where are they? If these are the same Paraguay people from back then, where are they? Because when you go to Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and all these parts of Brazil, you're going to see copper-colored people. And you just heard from 1630 to 1650, 100,000 to 200,000 Americans from Paraguay were being taken there and sold as slaves. It says here, in any case, Chief Martin of the Carijo nation complained to the Spanish in 1576 that the Portuguese of southern Brazil were carrying their children off to other parts of Brazil and then to Portugal to be sold as slaves. A Jesuit witnessed in 1635 a slave raid using 15 seagoing ships and many large canoes designed reportedly to secure 12,000 slaves from the Carijo nation. 12,000 slaves. One must suppose that many were to be secured for sale outside of Brazil. We can, I think, be confident that the Americans soon appeared in the Portuguese colonies in Africa and in the Cabo Verde Islands. Cabo Verde Islands. The high death rates on Portuguese sailing vessels of the period would make necessary for replenishing of crews in Brazil, and a somewhat later date, the use of the Brazilian natives and mixed bloods in the African trade in various capacities. So you hear this? What I was been saying the whole time? They're saying that be sure that they are using Brazilian natives in the African trade in various capacities, because they were already up in there for hundreds of years, I guess, you can say, basically, in Cabo Verde Island in West Africa. Some Americans were utilized as military auxiliaries to Portuguese soldiers as well. So they're talking about indigenous people when they say Americans, right? In 1641, auxiliaries were to be sent from Bahia and Rio de Janeiro to reinforce the troops in Angola. Alright, so you hear that they were sending American Indians from Bahia and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to reinforce troops in Angola in Africa, right? And in 1644, the king approved as project to send Enrique Diaz with non-white auxiliaries from Bahia to Angola. Diaz was needed instead of in Brazil to fight the Dutch, but in 1645 an expedition left Rio de Janeiro for Angola. Again in 1648 and 9, some 2,000 men were sent from Rio de Janeiro to Angola. Alright, American Indians being sent to fight wars in Angola. The Portuguese troops in Angola were accompanied in their campaigns by auxiliary native troops, and thus we can be confident that the Brazilian contingents included persons of American origins, alright, in Angola, and they say a lot of Cape Verdeans are spread out in Angola as well, and we know that Angola is supposed to be one of those places where they got a lot of the so-called Africans to come in the plantations, but we see happen in reverse. We're talking about since way before, since the 1500s, there were sending American Indians over to these parts, these colonies the Portuguese had, especially in Angola. After 1650, Angola was virtually a colony of Brazil, and we can be sure that many persons of American ancestry went there, alright? 1650, Angola was virtually a colony of Brazil. It was a colony of Brazil, not the other way around, people. In addition to the normal kinds of contact, Angola was used as a place for sending Americans and other persons who proved troublesome in Brazil. So they were sending rebel Indians, those who were fighting back the Portuguese and Spanish and the Jesuits and all these Christians that were going over there to enslave them and take their things, invade their country, take their land. So they would send all these rebel Indians over to Angola, alright, the troublesome ones, alright. In Ceará, for example, mixed blood and American undesirables were periodically rounded up and shipped off to Angola. 1720s onwards. Alright, 1720s, they're supposed to be coming from that side. No, after about 1740, the island of Fernão de Noronha was also used as a dumping ground for such people. Alright, this island off the coast of Brazil. In the south of Brazil, Americans and other non-whites were deported to Angola for gold smuggling or for using a route passing through a region exposed to attack by free Americans forces in the 1720s. Quite early, Americans were used in the settlement of Fernão de Noronha Island. In 1602, a Portuguese man was residing on the island with 13 or 14 Negroes. Alright, again, these are Americans they're calling Negroes. In 1612, a French vessel found only a Portuguese with a few tapuyas of both sexes. So tapuyas are natives of both sexes. The French removed the Americans to Maranhão. The Portuguese generally referred to Tupi-speaking Americans of coastal Brazil as Brasis or Brazilians, while the non-Tupi nations were often referred to collectively as tapuyas. Many American slaves were resold from Portugal to other countries, and this trade continued for at least a century. They're saying so Native Americans were being brought to Portugal, and from there resold to other countries. So from there they were telling people they were African, right? Because they were black. And they're teaching everybody was coming from Africa, all these Negroes, so-called Negroes, right? So it says in 1592, for example, a widower of Lisbon sold Beatriz, age 12, originally from Pernambuco, Brazil, to the Canary Islands. Many Americans were sold as slaves in Spain, as revealed by the notarial records of Seville and Valencia. It is not possible to be certain as to the numbers involved, since not all the slaves seem to have been properly registered, and also baptismal records are relatively scant. Moreover, many slaves are classified only to their color. It says here, from the 1590s onward, Dutch warships frequently captured Spanish and Portuguese vessels, many of which were loaded with slaves or possessed crew members of non-white race. So we're talking about the American Indians they were grabbing, right? The Spanish and the Portuguese, as we just read all the accounts. Some of these slaves were taken to Europe, while others were sold to the English in Virginia. Alright, here we go. It's time to get to America now. Or were sent to Dutch ports in the Americas, New Amsterdam and Curaçao, for example. New Amsterdam up there in New York, Massachusetts, all that area. We know that some of the captives were persons with Spanish Christian names and were not new slaves from Africa. So they're telling us straight up that they were not Africans. Okay, you're hearing that, right? They weren't Africans. These were Native Americans. We already read all the accounts. Now we gotta, the lies that the Americans saying they were grabbing, or these English were grabbing Negroes from the Spanish ships that were coming from Africa, but they weren't. As you can say here, they had Christian names, were not new slaves from Africa. In fact, some of those who arrived in Virginia were Carib people. They were Carib people. Alright, so very important. I've been wanting to get to this part of the lesson for a long time now, but so far I've shown you a lot of correlation to what the Spanish and Portuguese were actually doing over here, than how they were enslaving in large amounts, the American Indians, bringing them to that other side of the world over there, Europe and West Africa. Alright, so I ran into this article. I'm going to get more in depth in this article in upcoming videos, but this is like a little sneak peek. Alright, so it's called The Illegal Beginning of American Negro Slavery. And this was actually, I found this in a journal from the American Bar Association, journal volume 56, number 1, from 1970. And this is from pages 45 to 49. Alright, in case you want to go look for it. And this is the author of this article in this journal entry. A graduate of the Indiana University, A.B. 1950, J.D. 1952, William J. Wood, practices law in Indianapolis. He is a frequent contributor to legal journals. Alright, so this is the person, a constant contributor to legal journals. Alright, it's going to be a good video coming up on this, but this is just a little sneak peek again. the document we read, The Illegal Beginnings of the American Negro Slave, it reminds us who these Negroes that arrived in Jamestown, Virginia were. It says, such was the situation when the first 20 Negroes arrived in 1619 as part of a prize taken by piracy from a Spanish ship in the Indies. They were simply indentured for their passage. Alright, so clearly they're coming from the Caribbean, the Indies, just like the other document, Africans and Native Americans just told us. So they've been lying to us this whole time. When we're growing up reading that some Dutch ship came in with Africans, there were actually English ships who had used the Dutch names we read last week, right? And got some Negroes from the Spanish ship. They stole them from the West Indies. This ship was actually off the coast of Veracruz in Mexico in the Caribbean. Okay? Now, this goes even more back. The so-called first slaver, John Hawkins. Let's talk about him real quick. The second son of William Hawkins, another slave trader before him. He was actually going to Brazil, South America. West County merchant trader says here, John Hawkins was born at Plymouth. As a youth, he made a number of voyages to the Spanish-held Canary Islands, where he first learned the profits to be made from selling, quotes, African slave, close quotes, in Spain's American colonies. In 1559, he married Catherine Gonson, the daughter of the treasurer of Queen Elizabeth's navy. Gonson and his friend helped supply Hawkins with 3 ships for his first slaving voyage in 1562.
One of those ships is called Jesus.
Now let's remember that, there's accounts of Spanish and Portuguese, right, slaving Native Americans up as early as 1493 until way into 1562. All right, so especially in the 1500s, 1501, 52, they were really taking them, right, from Hispaniola, from Terra Nova, Newfoundland, and from the coast of Brazil, right? So by 1562, damage had already been done, right? So who was in West Africa by that time in 1562? We already know, we read all these accounts, that it was a lot of Native Americans, because these islands were uninhabited, remember? Especially those in the coast, like Cape Verde. Now remember that. So this first slaver, right, he was supplied 3 ships, and this was in 1562. Now I'm going to read to you where exactly he got these first so-called Negroes for his first slaving voyage. John Hawkins, cousin of Sir Francis Drake, conceived the idea of selling slaves to Spanish colonists. Despite the Spanish embargo on trade with non-Spaniards, Hawkins picked up a cargo of Negroes on the African coast and successfully peddled them in Spanish America, thereby becoming England's first slaver. For this feat, Captain Hawkins became an instant hero at home. Now, from the books of the historic voyages gathered by the Halliock Society, and from books that were printed in 1611, we get this account of John Hawkins. John Hawkins' first voyage to the West Indies, it actually tells us where he got these so-called Negroes from, what part of West Coast Africa, right? So after the statement made that he grabs 300 or so-called Negroes from the coast of Guinea, on the footnote on that statement, it tells us that he was much aggravated, Mr. Hawkins, at the information given by the Minions people to certain Negro tribes near Cape Verde, of nature very gentle and loving, whom he was attempting to kidnap. So basically, he kidnapped from Cape Verde Indians, Native Americans that were already there, brought already there by the Portuguese, by the Spanish, almost 100 years before. I'm reading from the book now called Columbus and Other Cannibals, the Wetiko Disease of Exploitation. And it says here, after learning of the reported existence of so-called Carib people who allegedly ate human flesh, Columbus developed plans for their large-scale enslavement. The Caribs, after correction, would be better than any other slaves whatsoever. Again, remember, Columbus said that they would make perfect slaves. On January 30, 1494, Columbus proposed to the Spanish crown that the enslavement of Americans would pay for the cost of the conquest. We got this on the first part of this enslavement video, right? Colon and his compatriots first began to enslave Taino Arawak people who were neither cannibalistic nor warlike. Alright, they weren't even cannibalistic. Lacasse's notes, he will finish in very short time consuming all the people of this island, Haiti, because he was determined to load the ships, which would go to the Castile with slaves and to send them to sell to the Canary and Azores and Cabo Verde Islands. Again, Cabo Verde Islands. This is before John Hawkins arrived to Cabo Verde to kidnap the so-called Negroes there. Again, they were grabbing Columbus and all these Spaniards. As soon as they got here, were grabbing and sending them to Castile, to Spain, to Cabo Verde, to Canary Islands, to the Azores. All right, way before 1562. So lies my teacher told me corresponds to what we were just talking about, which said in 1501 the Portuguese began to depopulate Labrador, transporting the now extinct Botoc Indians to Europe and Cape Verde as slaves. Again, they brought Indians, American Indians, to Cape Verde as slaves from Newfoundland and Canada, or that area they used to call Terra Nova, Labrador. Alright? Again, 1501, way before 1562, right? When John Hawkins went to Cape Verde. So, before John Hawkins went to Cape Verde, the Botoc had already been taken, enslaved, and sent to Cape Verde as slaves. Do the research. Again, we got this in the first part of this enslavement videos that I'm doing. It says here, Africans and Native Americans by Jack Force. Columbus was the major supplier of American slaves prior to 1500. As noted earlier, he caused some 3,000 to perhaps 6,000 slaves to be sent to Europe. And also, if we are to believe that his plans were implemented to the Azores, Canary Islands, Madeira, and Cabo Verde Islands. Again, Cabo Verde Islands, way before John Hawkins. By the year 1500, however, a great escalation began in the shipment of Americans across the Atlantic, since other Spaniards and the Portuguese became directly active. They were enslaving American Indians, the Spanish and Portuguese, and these English were pirating. They were pirating what the Spanish and Portuguese had, which were American Indians. They weren't Africans. In the year 1500, Americans were directly transported to Europe from the Caribbean islands, from the coast of South America, and from Terra Nova up in Canada. Now, let's get a clear perspective of what I'm trying to explain here, alright? So, the history of Cape Verde, if you go do the research, right, they tell us that it was discovered in the 15th century, in the 1400s, 1456, by Henry the Navigator. You gotta read on him, who he was. And it says that when they first arrived, these Europeans, that this place was uninhabited, or as they say here, when these mariners first landed in Cape Verde, the islands were barren of people, but not vegetation. Alright, not vegetation. That's important. I'm about to show you something. So, if these islands were uninhabited, then who are these so-called Cape Verdeans that John Hawkins is grabbing by 1562? Alright, we already know, right? We've seen all the accounts of all the thousands of Indians that are being brought to Cape Verde, right? Alright, so let me show you this now. It says here, before Columbus' time, American cottons were carried across the oceans to parts of the Old World. Historical documents from the Cape Verde Islands show that G. hirsutum, the Mexican species, had apparently reached the Guinea coast of Africa by means of some unrecorded voyage before Columbus' first voyage. Cape Verdean records report that a cotton arrived there from West Africa some 25 years prior to 1492. Remnants of that cotton turned out to have the American triploid genetic structure. Alright, so this is native to America, and it was already on that side of the world, in Cape Verde and West Africa, telling you there was people going over there way before Columbus. So was it really uninhabited? We know that the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks tell us that they had colonies in Cape Verde and America. So we know these people were actually from America. Alright, this is the true old world. So Cape Verde has been a spot for transatlantic voyage for a long time now. Alright, and we know that by 1562, a lot of these people, these so-called Negroes or Cape Verdeans that were there, that John Hawkins kidnapped, were of American origin. Again, this so-called hero, this first slaver from England, right? He was grabbing so-called Negroes from Cape Verde. This was in 1562 in his first voyage, and this is way after American Indians were already being taken to Cape Verde by Spanish and Portuguese, Dutch. Alright? If you read this book right here, he tells you these are Negro people. He talks about their diet, how it's better than the other tribes, how they're very civilized people, more than the other tribes in Africa. He gives them certain names. He tells us they use bows and arrows and darts that are different than the other tribes. Alright, so now I grew up with Cape Verdeans. So before I knew all this history, I always had a strong connection. You know, they seemed more to me like people I would know in Costa Rica or America, not like Africans like from Nigeria, West Africa, or, you know, those other countries. Alright, they resembled more Americans. And if you see how they look, you're gonna see what I'm talking about as well. And if you look at how people in Dominican Republic, Haiti, you know, the eastern tribes, the Algonquin tribes, if you see how they look, you'll see a lot of resemblances with Cape Verdeans, right? Because Cape Verdeans, again, were mostly American Indians that were being taken over there. Alright, so you might know this person right here, Blue Cantrell, you know, famous singer, I believe songwriter as well. And it says here in the bottom that she was born Tiffany Cobb from Providence, Rhode Island, New England. A lot of Cape Verdeans up there. And her father is of Narragansett and Cape Verdean. So he's Narragansett and Cape Verdean. You're going to see that's a trend up in New England. A lot of these tribal people were formerly or have been known to be Cape Verdean as well. And now if you go compare how these Narragansett people look with Cape Verdeans, and I'm not talking about just one person, you know, meet a lot of them, go see how they look, all of them, and go meet Cape Verdeans, you're going to see a lot of resemblances, alright? So here we have Lisa Lopez. I'm sure you all know her. She's from TLC, right? The group, the female group from back in the 90s. TLC, Lisa Lopez. It says that she's of Cape Verdean and Portuguese and African American descent. So what does that mean? Alright, because Cape Verdeans were colonized by Portuguese. So what are they trying to say here? And then African American, dodge the hijack, right? We crossed that out. That just means aboriginal, right? Indigenous. Alright, so she's basically indigenous is what they're telling you. Because many American Indians, by the thousands, were taken to Cape Verde. So how do we know she's not one of those descendants? Alright? Alright, so we continue in the book Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. We're almost done, you know. I just want to finish off with the info here. It says here, after being expelled from Brazil in 1654, the Dutch, or many of them, and the Portuguese Jews who had joined them, retreated with slaves. Again, Portuguese Jews. And they retreated with slaves, servants, and a plantation ideology to other places. And they're talking about other places in America. For example, 900 such persons, free and enslaved, left Brazil and migrated to Guadeloupe and Martinique. In addition, the Dutch had been actively selling slaves in the French islands, as noted. We know that many of the slaves on the islands were Brazilians, okay? Not Africans. Americans from Brazil and Arawakis, so Arawaks, perhaps from the Guyana coast, Guyana, in South America. In 1656, some 20 Brazilian slaves helped suppress an Angolan rebellion on Guadeloupe. As late as 1767, the Brazilian term Mamaluco was still being used on Martinique. The Dutch, along with the French and English, were active along the Guyana coast, and that's in South America again, during this same period. The Dutch in particular developed for a time a route from the Essequibo River via the Rio Negro. Again, Rio Negro, that's the real name of the Amazon. It was originally called the River Niger or Negro, to the Amazon, bringing back canoe loads of slaves to the coast from the Amazon, slaves, not from Africa. They made peace with the Lokono, Arawak people of Suriname, and by the late 1680s with the adjacent Carib groups. The friendly tribes, especially the Caribs, continued to supply the Dutch with American slaves from the interior until the mid-19th century. The island of Curaçao was also used by the Dutch as a center for the resale of slaves, and it would appear that Americans were still being obtained along the wild coast of South America well into the 19th century. That's the 1800s. All right, so they're letting you know, all right, that, the Dutch were enslaving American Indians since the 1500s all the way up into the 1800s, 300 years. How many of them? Thousands and thousands, right? Who was keeping track, really? The ultimate disposition of the American slaves from the Suriname, Orinoco, Amazon watersheds, and the Curaçao region is not known to me. Some Suriname area natives were sent to Barbados from 1627 to help develop the sugar industry there. Perhaps others were sold with black Africans, let's touch the hijack, to all available markets, or were taken to Dutch colonies in Africa and elsewhere. Again, taken to Dutch colonies in Africa and elsewhere. Do you know the Dutch colonies in Africa, what those countries are? Yes. Alright. So a lot of Americans were taken to those countries. During all this period, Americans were held as slaves or were being enslaved in Brazil. This was true in the Amazonian region, where Native American labor was in constant demand for the Para-Sierra area. One Jesuit estimated that 3 million Indians were descended as slaves from the Rio Negro alone. We're talking about the Amazon when they say Rio Negro. In the century up to 1750, 3 million Indians. While this figure may be exaggerated, there is no question but that some Portuguese possessed more than 1,000 American slaves each. 1,000 slaves each, American slaves, not Africans. The Bishop of Bahia in Brazil in 1827 noted that 20,000 Americans in his province were suited to all kinds of work and industry. Another speaker mentioned 200,000 who can immediately settle Brazil. In the middle of the 19th century, a British visitor to the Guyana-Suriname region noted how prevalent the Indian slave trade has been and how recently carried on, even without our boundaries. It still prevails on the southern borders of our colony and the northern tributaries of the Amazon. He noted further that Makusi of the interior were especially victimized. The Brazilians, as well as the Caribs, Acahuayos, etc., have long been in the habit of enslaving them. Slavery also continued in other sections of Brazil. In 1741, some 8,000 Kai'apo people of Goiás were enslaved. 8,000 Kai'apo people of Goiás were enslaved. Large numbers of carijos, servants, were present in the south, sometimes classified as administered Indians, but in practice used in servile status. Okay? These are Indians, not Africans. In the Spanish Empire and the independent republics established therefrom, slavery or semi-slavery also continued from the late 17th through the 19th century, in spite of laws prohibiting such. Along the northern frontier of Mexico, slavery continued during the 1690s and persisted until the 1860s, primarily involving Apaches, Navajos, Pauitis, Javapais, and other border nations, whose resistance made them subject to being captured. Some natives from this region were shipped to the West Indies. Again, you saw all these tribes, right? Apaches, Navajos, Pauitis, Javapais. Some of these were shipped where? To the West Indies. Who's arriving at the West Indies? Not Africans. More American natives. While others, such as the Yaqui in the 1880s, were sold to Yucatan. The Yaqui ended up in the Yucatan, Mexico. After the abortive Tupac Amaru rebellion in Peru in 1781, yes, it was a guy named Tupac Amaru who led a rebellion in Peru in the 1780s. However, the Inca nobility suspected of disloyalty to Spain were executed, imprisoned, or shipped to exile in Spanish Sahara. They sent them to North Africa. What? Incas, Tupac Amaru's people, to the Spanish Sahara. Thus, some Americans reached till another part of Africa. You see all what's going on. It's in reverse. It should also be...
You've been listening to the history of the black folks that was sent from America, the natives, all the way to Africa, all the way to Portugal, Spain, the Caribbeans, Mexico, prior to the Africans that were kidnapped, taken, and brought here to America. This is Black Native American history. I thank you all for listening. I know it's kind of long, but I just wanted to get that out to you all, especially to those who don't know and didn't know. And I want you all to go and research and study for yourselves and get the information, because it's part of your identity. It's part of who you are. And knowledge is power. Verbal Prick Radio, we're out.